Hello, my name is Tiago and I'm a cloud solution architect working with professional services accounts here at Microsoft. In this video, you will see one of the main building blocks of our Horizon solutions, which is the structured data ingestion with the common data model, also known as CDM. This is one of our Horizon solutions called Enhancing Audit Quality. What you see here, and in many other Horizon solutions, is that the process starts with data coming from multiple sources, such as different ERPs, each with its own data model. The solution suggests bringing data from all these different sources into a common model, which will then feed the downstream systems. The benefit of that is for everything beyond the CDM repository that you see there, it doesn't really matter what the original data source is, if it's SAP or Oracle, for example, because the schema will be the same. This allows all further processes, such as analytics and reporting, to be developed over a single schema. And another benefit is that the common data model that everything gets mapped to can be created custom, or it can leverage one that has been published by our experts and partners. So this is what you see in this demo. We have ERP data, in this case coming from Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, but it could also be from SAP, Oracle, or any other ERP or structured data source. And we will bring this data into a common data model. We will do that by leveraging Azure Data Factory to perform the mapping and syncing the data in Azure Data Lake. Before we start building, let's quickly go over what the common data model is and its main features and benefits. So CDM is a data definition language that includes a rich metadata system with entities, attributes, relationships, and traits. And we'll talk about what each of those mean in a second. The CDM is implemented by multiple systems and platforms. This means that most Azure data services, the Power Platform, and even partner tools such as Informatica are able to read and understand the model that you define using the CDM language. Also, you can utilize open source models or build your own. Microsoft and partners are contributing to the effort of building these models, including some industry-specific concepts. So here are the main aspects around CDM. First, you have entities, which is a common concept, such as account or contact, just like a table in a database. Then each entity has its set of attributes, just like you have columns in a database. And then you have relationships, which can be defined from and to an entity and attribute, just like a foreign key. And finally, you have traits, which is additional metadata that can be applied to attributes to provide semantic meaning. So for example, you can have a trait called is displayable on a map that you attach to any attribute that has a full address or a coordinate. And then all applications that you build that leverage your CDM model are able to know that that field can be displayed on a map. So let's start with how a model is defined using the common data model language. We will work with general ledger data coming from Dynamics. So I'll define a very simplistic general ledger model that has a single entity called journal transaction. Here's the manifest file, which lists all the entities. So here's our common data model name, general ledger, and here is my journal transaction name, which is my single entity. And this is the entity file, which defines the attributes of each entity. So here we have our entity name, journal transaction, and here we have the 4 attributes from that entity. So we have invoice, which is a string, credit amount, which is a double, debit amount, which is a double, and transaction date, which is a date. If we had traits, they would be listed here. And if we had relationships, they would be listed in our manifest file. As you heard before, instead of building our own model, we could be leveraging open source models instead, in which case we would then download the CDM JSON files that define that model, and they will look just like these ones that we created. If we load our CDM schema files in the CDM Navigator tool, which is available on GitHub, we're able to see the model we just defined. Now we will set up the process in Azure Data Factory to bring the data from Dynamics to our common data model on Azure Data Lake. The first step is to drop our schema files in the data lake. With this, we'll be able to point any tool that supports CDM to those files, and the tool will immediately know what your model looks like. So here are my files, along with some necessary CDM base files in the data lake. And now we can build a data flow in Azure Data Factory to bring the data from Dynamics. This will be a simple load that only requires mapping, but you can also count on Azure Data Factory to support more complex operations, such as joins and transformations if needed. Step 1 is to connect to the data source, which is a SQL table containing Dynamics data, and loading the schema. And here is the original table and data. Step 2 is to set up the sink, which will be a common data model in Azure Data Lake storage. And then we need to point Azure Data Factory to those schema files. So I'm saying here that they are in the schema container, and my CDM is called General Ledger, and the entity that I'm working with here is the journal transaction entity. And also, I'm saying here that the data will sync in a container called data container in my General Ledger CDM. Next step will be the mapping. So here we have our dynamic schema on one side, and I'm mapping it to my common data model on the other side. And then all we need to do is execute this pipeline, and it will result in my data container having the data that just came from Dynamics. So here's a CSV file containing the data. And here's what it looks like, my 4 attributes here and the data that came from the Dynamics table. So in this video, you'll learn how to create a common data model and ingest data from an ERP. Now that we're done with Dynamics, we could set up the same for SAP, Oracle, Adobe, and more. We have other building block videos like this one. You can also look at semi-structured data ingestion from receipts or text forms with Form Recognizer, or unstructured data ingestion from contracts with LouisD custom text, and more to come. Thank you.